State power, therefore, still lacks a will with which to oppose counsel and the power to decide which of the different opinions is best for the general good. It is not yet a government, and therefore not yet in truth an actual state power. The being for self, the will, which as will is not sacrificed, is the inner, separated spirit of the various classes and estates, and this, in spite of its chatter about the general good, reserves to itself what suits its own best interest, and is inclined to make this chatter about the general good a substitute for action. The sacrifice of existence which happens in the service of the state is indeed complete when it has gone as far as death, but the hazard of death which the individual survives leaves him with a definite existence and hence with a particular self-interest, and this makes his counsel about what is best for the general good ambiguous and open to suspicion. It means that he has in fact reserved his own opinion and his own particular will in face of the power of the state. His conduct, therefore, conflicts with the interests of the state and is characteristic of the ignoble consciousness, which is always on the point of revolt. Paragraph 506 is simply fascinating in the dynamic that Hegel is describing here, and I can think of a couple historical examples that he probably has very closely in mind, and we'll come back to them in just a bit. Thinking of France in the time before Louis XIV, before state power truly became consolidated, and I'm thinking about Germany at the time of the wars of religion, where all these electors were able to bollocks things up pretty well and plunge Germany into a civil war that made it the battleground of all these other competing powers. So Hegel talks here about an underdeveloped state power, right? It's not yet quite state power. He says, why? Because it still lacks a will with which to oppose counsel. Now that's an interesting way to put things as a criterion for what would really be state power. It doesn't lack an essential will, as we saw in the last paragraph. It lacks a particular will to oppose counsel, to say, no, we're not going to do this. I'm going to listen to these guys, and you over there, enough talking, get in line, or, shut up, or consider yourself in revolt. The sort of, the buck stops here that allows adjudication to actually happen and some sort of decision to be made. Notice that what Hegel opposes this to is what he's going to call a little bit later chatter about the general good that winds up being a substitute for action. Endless talking, right? And it's interesting that Miller translates it as the general good, because what the German has is the allgemeine Beste, the universal or common best. Here, I think it's very good to think in terms of the best, and that phrase that we have of allowing the best to become the enemy of the good, which generally means an ideal best that won't be realized, but which everybody talks about and criticizes for not reaching, stands in the way of accomplishing some sort of concrete good, which is what state power for Hegel is ultimately about. If it's going to be something more than just a mere tyranny, if it's going to help us realize our freedom, it's going to be about some sort of substantive good and its realization. So what's going on? Hegel has already said in the previous paragraph that there's no problem with the law being developed. What's missing here is a government, an effective principle of decision, of rulership. This doesn't mean that there's nobody there in charge, right? It means that they're ineffective. It means that they're unable to deal with the various voices that are all saying, we should do this, we should do this, we should do this. Notice that what we're talking about here is some sort of participatory, albeit, of course, in some imperfect way, but participatory way of handling all of the things that a state handles. Who should we go to war with? What should our trade policies be? Should we tax people? Shouldn't we tax people? How about building some roads? Maybe some aqueducts? Maybe some baths? All those sorts of questions that are coming up inevitably. So he says state power lacks the power to decide which of the different opinions is best for the general good. Which of these opinions should we listen to, and which should we say no to? Which should we ask, hey, can you tell me more? What are your plans? How would we pay for this? How should we put this into practice? What's the nitty-gritty of your proposal? That's the sort of thing that governments have to ask. And everybody, because they realize they can all talk as much as they like, is coming to the government and giving some advice. Now, the problem is, how do you determine which advice is the best advice? You do need some advice, right? Because if you knew it all, well, you wouldn't need anybody else giving input. The very fact that you're taking input isn't just about everybody getting to feel like they have a voice, or as we say, a seat at the table, or buy-in, or anything like that. Because if the ruler, the state power, had it all figured out, they could just say, everybody shut the hell up. I'm going to decide. We're going to do things this way. You're going to love it. But that's not what happens. And that's not what happens throughout history, right? We see constantly people asking other people, well, what do you think? Well, what should we do? We have councils. This is Rat in German, council, right? So he says, what's lacking here? The being for self, the will, which as will is not sacrificed, is the inner separated spirit of what? The various, as we're translating it here, classes and estates, in German, die Stände, all of these various interests that have some sort of power basis or structure or some authority. And if we're talking, now let's actually talk about medieval Europe, right? What would we be discussing? There's that old traditional division of, the estates. We can also talk about, the nobility, the clergy, the burghers, right? The farmers, and some divided things into those who pray, those who defend, those who farm. And I guess everyone else kind of fit in there wherever. There's always this tendency to split, groups into their own associations based on interest. And there can be a lot of divisions within that, right? The nobility, some of them are traditionally rivals with each other. They represent different areas. They're trying to encroach on each other's territory. In the Middle Ages, when the church actually holds a lot of land, abbots, bishops often are secular powers. You see this in the Song of Roland, right, where one of the great war leaders is this bishop who's going around cracking people with his I think he's got a mace, or he might have actually a sword in that one. All of these different competing voices are each motivated by their own particular interest. So the counsel that you're getting from them is not disinterested. They may, in fact, be saying something that is for the common good, but they might also be saying something to line their own pockets, or to improve their own power position, or to get a concession that matters in some other realm altogether. Or they may just be trying to stick it to their rivals, There's all these different possibilities. So he says that this being for self, the will, is not sacrificed. We saw that in the last paragraph. The will of the noble, the haughty vassal, is not sacrificed. And this is the separated spirit of the various classes and estates. This, in spite of its chatter about the general good, reserves to itself what suits its own best interest, and is inclined to make this chatter about the general good a substitute for action. We call this chatter about the general good in our political system gridlock. And there are some people for whom gridlock works great. As a matter of fact, the financial interests, for the most part, banks, the insurance companies, traders, they love when there's gridlock. As a matter of fact, so do law firms. You know why? Because gridlock means that nothing new is really going to happen to shake things up, to transform the society that we're looking at. Gridlock reduces volatility, which helps to increase profits, or at least makes them more reliable, more secure. Gridlock doesn't work well for other interests which are always trying to overturn that. This is an age-old dynamic. This doesn't just happen here in 21st century late capitalist liberal democracies. It happened in the Middle Ages as well. There were always people looking to change things, and other people were like, nah, let's balance these things off against each other and everything will be nice and good the way we like it. So there's always this possibility of particular interests, winning out. Now he goes on and he talks a bit about the individual as well. He says, the sacrifice of existence which happens in the service of the state is indeed complete when it has gone as far as death. Now, who risks death? Does the burgher class risk death? I mean, I suppose you could say that the burgher class of a particular city does when they take up arms against their lord or hire the mercenaries who are going to fight against, the oppressive taxer or something like that. But for the most part, it's not the class or the estate that is facing death. It's rather individuals. And this introduces another wrinkle, right? The individual risks death, faces death, fears death, and the counsel that they're going to give is going to be affected by that as well. Hegel says that the hazard of death which the individual survives leaves him with a definite existence, hence with a particular self-interest. This makes his counsel about what is best for the general good ambiguous and open to suspicion. Everybody has got a particular take. And everybody's particular take is something that it may not be at odds with the general good, but it may certainly be deformed, corrupted, gone astray, to use Aristotle's language. So this is a perennial problem, and if you don't have some sort of decisive, strong principle here, a will that is conscious of itself as will, as government, how are you going to decide this? Do you just let one of these in and let them become the decider? So he goes on and he says, here we go. It means that he has in fact reserved his own opinion, his own particular will in the face of the power of the state. So what does this mean? This means that the noble individual starts to look a lot more like the base individual. He says that this person's conduct conflicts with the interests of the state and is characteristic of the ignoble consciousness, which is always on the point of revolt, which is always trying to get its own angle, which is always trying to make sure that it hedges its own bets rather than trust in the state. And why would it, in fact, trust in a state like this? This is an interesting issue. In order to be able to trust in the state, or if we want to think in terms of leadership in general, any organization, in order to trust that you're not going to get screwed over, you do in fact need leadership. Now, it may not be good leadership. It may be representing just one of these classes or estates. It may just be the individual ruling for his or her own benefit despotically. And then you don't buy into that, right? Then you're like, yeah, okay, I'll give you counsel, but it's going to cost you, and it's going to be to my benefit, and I'll keep something back as insurance just in case you try to screw me over. But if you do have something that really is a worthy state power, or at least leadership, well, then you've got something that becomes quite tempting to tie yourself in with, to sacrifice more than just certain external advantages to, and then you're posed with a real issue. I mentioned that we could talk about historical examples. I think Louis XIV provides us with an excellent example of this. We tend to think of Louis XIV because of the history books as he was the Sun King, he was in charge of everything. You know, France was this massive power under his reign, and that's all true. What we leave out quite often is the fact that Louis was forced to flee France, if I remember, flee France itself, because of a revolution when he was a youth. And he saw that all of these competing interests needed to be checked, that the only thing that could keep each of them from trying to get their own thing out of the state, all of them were sort of on the make, all of them were trying to take over the state and impose their own governance, was a strong government that stood over and above them and reined all of them in. That was the lesson that he learned. That didn't happen in Germany and still hadn't happened in Germany at the time that Hegel is writing the Phenomenology. He will, in effect, tie himself in with the Prussian state, in part because Prussia, Bavaria, and Austria were really the only main contenders for having a shot at unifying Germany, at bringing together all of these different classes and interests. It wasn't just about unifying these little territories. It was about finding some way to bring together all of these different, Stände in a state where they would, in fact, just stop chattering constantly about the common good, and the common good could, in fact, be realized. So, what is the individual's stance at this point? We see a kind of shifting here. Will they remain noble or will they go into ignobility? Well, that's what we have to look at next. This contradiction which being for self must resolve, that of the disparity between its being for self and the state power, is at the same time present in the following form. That renunciation of existence when it is complete, as it is in death, is simply a renunciation. It does not return into consciousness. Consciousness does not survive the renunciation, is not in and for itself, but merely passes over into its unreconciled opposite. Consequently, the true sacrifice of being for self is solely that in which it surrenders itself as completely as in death. Yet in this renunciation, no less preserves itself. It thereby becomes in actuality what it is in itself, becomes the identical unity of itself and of its opposed self. The separated inner spirit, the self as such, having come forward and renounced itself, the state power is at the same time raised to the position of having a self of its own. Without this renunciation of self, the deeds of honor, the deeds of the noble consciousness, and the counsels based on its insight would retain the ambiguity possessed by that private reserve of particular intention and self-will. Hegel begins paragraph 507 by talking about a contradiction, a Widerspruch, between being for self and the state power. And the state power, as we've seen so far, has not yet been realized as a self. It hasn't had a particular will, although it did have an essential will. And Hegel is going to tell us that this contradiction has to be addressed. Being for self is going to have to do this in order to figure out what the hell it is at this point, in order to make sense of its own being for self, and in order to have something that it considers genuinely essential, genuinely valuable for it. So how does it do this? He tells us that it does it through renunciation, through risking something. And death provides us with a model for it. So he says, renunciation of existence when it is complete, as it is in death, is simply a renunciation. It leaves nothing behind. So that's not really a workable means for consciousness. But if it only renounces some of what it has, then it seems like it's caught in this position of the haughty vassal or noble, right? The noble consciousness that kind of reserves to itself quite a bit of stuff on its own and doesn't fully commit itself. And then it seems like virtue and the way of the world is just being repeated here, isn't it? That everybody is really on the make. It's just some people call themselves noble and some people are more honest about it. Is there another possibility? Could it be something other than death that happens in this renunciation? What if you did renounce your entire self, as well as your possessions, as well as your position, and you got it back? That should actually remind us of something that happens in Kierkegaard, of course, in Fear and Trembling. But, I'll just pass over that here. Just, keep that in mind when people say how totally opposed Hegel and Kierkegaard are. So he says here, the issue is that when there's a renunciation that does not return into consciousness, consciousness does not survive the renunciation. It does not become in and for itself, but merely passes over into its unreconciled opposite. So what if consciousness truly sacrifices being for self, but it at the same time manages to preserve itself by getting itself back? This sort of loyalty, which is what we're talking about here, is not possible in every circumstance, and as a matter of fact would be ill-advised in many circumstances. Hegel is a big proponent of things having to come at their proper time and in the proper conditions for history. It's not like you can simply force the dialectic by deciding, okay, I like this stage better, we're going to jump right there. Consciousness has to have something that it can actually pin its hopes upon in this case. And so that is what it's going to be looking at. So here he says, what does it do? If it is able to renounce and preserve itself, it becomes, he calls it, the identical unity of itself and its opposed self. The separated inner spirit, the self as such, coming forth, renouncing itself. That's all great. That's going to have to do with state power. But what's going on down here between the self and the opposed self? Is this the self and the other? Is this the dialectic of self-consciousness again? The struggle for recognition? How are these being harmonized? What are we talking about here? Is state power the opposed self? Is the ignoble self-consciousness the opposed self? Hegel doesn't actually tell us at this point. So we're going to have to see what he says in the next paragraph or so. But that's a really interesting challenge to think about, isn't it? Now, what does happen? The state power is finally being constituted as a self, as a particular will, as being for itself, no longer merely in itself, as conscious as being state power. No, that's a very different sort of thing to align yourself with, to identify yourself with, to make sacrifice to engage, as Hegel says, in deeds of heroism, noble deeds, honorable deeds, and in giving counsel. Now notice that he says that if this doesn't happen, he says without this renunciation of self, then the deeds of the noble consciousness and the counsels based on its insight would retain the ambiguity, the Doppelheit, the Doppelsinn the doubling possessed by that private reserve of particular intention and self-will. If it doesn't this is where you have to make a moment of decision. The noble self-consciousness can only truly be the noble self-consciousness if it totally commits itself. Otherwise, it's really at risk for being a disguised form of the ignoble self-consciousness, just telling itself that it's noble and listening to the chatter of everybody, honoring it and saying, "Oh, you're such a great guy, so wonderful how you did those great deeds and provide that wonderful counsel." So absolute commitment. We see this in Hegel over and over again, this theme that the ethical really does require absolute commitment, absolute renunciation. But in this case, there's a recovery. There's a recuperation that's taking place that now allows a different relation of the noble self-consciousness to state power, precisely because state power itself has also changed in the process.